In this lesson, we will be looking at biodiversity. Chapter 16 covers conservation and biodiversity, and we're going to look a lot at human influences on the environment. In Chapter 16, we are going to address several questions. Some of these are, what is biodiversity? Why is biodiversity important, and why should we conserve it? Where can we find the most biodiversity? What are the threats to biodiversity, and how can we save biodiversity? The first question is, what is biodiversity? This is just like it sounds. Diversity is variety or variations, and bio stands for life. So we are going to be looking at all the variations and variety that are found in living organisms. Biodiversity occurs at multiple levels. We can see that there is diversity in genes and alleles of a population, within the species, and within ecosystems around the world. Genetic diversity is very important. This is the amount of diversity that occurs within and between populations of the same species. The more diverse a population is on a genetic level, generally the healthier that population will be. Species diversity looks at the number of individual species found in a particular place. This is important because the more species there are, the more healthy the overall community will be. It is common that many species depend upon each other for interactions, and without one, the whole ecosystem and community may collapse. We also see diversity at an ecosystem level. Different ecosystems have different roles or functions. Ecosystem diversity is at risk. Human activity is reducing ecosystem diversity at a staggering rate. For example, more than 50% of wetlands in the U.S. have been drained and converted into other types of ecosystems. So the next question is, why is biodiversity important? Why should we conserve it? Why should we care? Biodiversity is important for a great many reasons. Genetic diversity is important because without it, we often see fixation of bad traits in a population. Sometimes there is inbreeding when we lose a lot of genetic diversity, and this can bring out more bad traits in a population that are usually hidden because they are recessive. Populations that are less diverse are often susceptible to things like diseases, parasites, and other problems, and this brings about death of individuals, and eventually lack of genetic diversity can bring about death of a species. When we start to lose species, we disrupt food webs. This can cause an entire community to collapse. So sometimes we lose one species, and this is a domino effect, and many others will follow. Species diversity is often protected. In the United States, we have the Endangered Species Act. This act defines an endangered species as a group that is in danger of becoming extinct throughout all or a significant portion of its range. It also defines threatened species as those that are likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, right now, we are experiencing a steep increase in the number of endangered and threatened species worldwide. We've talked about extinctions before, when we lose an entire group of organisms. There is always a low background level of extinction, where a few species go extinct every year or every set of years. However, we've also looked at mass extinctions, when many species, 50% or more, go extinct all at once. It is strongly argued that we are currently going through a sixth mass extinction. This biodiversity crisis is mostly human-caused. In the last few hundred years, we have seen steep increases in the number of extinctions, especially in groups such as birds and mammals. This graph shows us that as human populations have increased at an exponential rate, we also see an almost exponential increase in the number of extinctions of both birds in the blue bars and mammals in the purple bars. This graphic shows us the number of threatened and endangered species in some of the major groups of organisms. We can see that the endangered animals and organisms, the ones that are yellow and red, are getting to be very high in numbers. Many of our plants, such as cycads, conifers, are in danger, We also see that many fish and other invertebrates like corals and crabs and dragonflies are in trouble. Reptiles have quite a few species in danger. But when we look at mammals, birds, and amphibians, we see huge numbers of species that are in danger of becoming extinct. These extinctions will have a massive effect globally, not just on humans, but on other species as well. Biodiversity is very valuable to us as humans and in general. We can look at two types of values of biodiversity, extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic value is value by biodiversity to humans. This is often described as things like ecosystem services. We can break this down into things like provisioning services, how we get useful products from different organisms. Biodiversity gives us cultural services, such as aesthetic and symbolic spiritual values. We use different organisms to represent different things. We have regulating services in the environment, which includes climate regulation, decomposition, and protection from natural disasters and diseases. We also have habitat services, which is where we get value from soil formation, photosynthesis, and nutrient cycling from different organisms and ecosystems. We're going to look at a few specific examples of how biodiversity is valuable to humans. Humans get a great number of products from biodiversity. Different organisms can provide us with different types of substances. In the U.S., about 25% of prescriptions contain substances that are originally derived from plants. For example, if we look at rosy periwinkle, this plant contains a type of alkaloid that inhibits cancer growth. Willows produce a substance called Taxol, which is another cancer-fighting drug. We also see that horseshoe crab blood clots in the presence of bacterial toxins. This means that we can use those substances to help us check for sterility and make sure that no bacteria are present in different solutions that we are studying. We can also use diversity at a genetic level. Wild populations of plants are often more diverse than our agricultural crops. Plant specialists and agriculturalists, farmers included, often take wild plants and crossbreed them with our agricultural crops to help increase things like virus resistance in our commercial rice. We also see the same kinds of things in corn. Wild populations of corn are more resistant to different types of diseases because of their genetic diversity. We can crossbreed these types of corn with our common corn and help increase genetic resistance to different diseases. This helps increase our yields overall and provides more food for people. We have a lot of research benefits as well. Desert pupfish, a type of fish, are important models for research in human kidney disease. We also can look at things like services that these organisms provide. Insects and other animals are pollinators. Without these pollinators to go around and go from flower to flower, we would not have a lot of our favorite foods. Most of the produce in our grocery stores comes from plants that are pollinated by bees. Many species of bees are now on the endangered species list. If we lose these bees, we may lose many of the produce that we find on the grocery store shelves. We can also look at regulating and habitat services. Sometimes these are grouped together and called ecosystem services. Ecosystem diversity is important. We see that local extinctions of one species can disrupt an entire ecosystem and cause a collapse in species in that ecosystem. A good example of this is when we see flying foxes, a type of bat, which are important pollinators and seed dispersers in the Pacific Island. If this bat were to go extinct, many of the species of trees that it eats fruit from would also go extinct. This would disrupt the whole ecosystem. Many organisms rely on those trees as food and shelter. Without them, we would see a loss of a great deal of diversity. Healthy ecosystems are also important for detoxification and decomposition of wastes. Different organisms, such as bacteria, fungi, and some animals, are able to break down dead and decaying materials and take those wastes and turn them into nutrients that other organisms need. This ties back to our nutrient cycling. Things like nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus are all cycled through these decomposers. We can also look at places like estuaries, where rivers meet oceans. These regions protect against flood and erosion. Whenever waters from the ocean rise, the estuaries can suck up that water and keep it from going further inland. This protects the inland and mainland areas from flood damage and protects from erosion. Sand dunes work in a similar way, as do barrier islands. When storms go through, waves and wind will hit the sand dunes and barrier islands first. They take the brunt of the storm and prevent erosion on our mainlands. There are many areas where we see that sand dunes have been torn down and places like condominiums have been put up. Florida is notorious for this. They like to tear down sand dunes on the barrier islands and put up condos and sell them for millions of dollars. They are now finding that when big storms such as hurricanes hit the area, the condos are now acting like the sand dunes. They absorb the shock from the storms and take a lot of damage. We also see that deterioration has increased the amount of damage and erosion on the mainlands. Some ecosystems can also purify air and water. Forests, for example, absorb a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They also maintain soil fertility, keeping nutrients in the area and preventing runoff. Forests also help retain water in an ecosystem. Estuaries, again, help with filtering water. Generally, these healthy ecosystems will have large populations of mussels or bivalves. These organisms are filter feeders, and they filter out the water and clean it up. This can be a multi-million-dollar industry. Humans have found that out the hard way. After destroying many estuaries or contaminating them and killing off the mussel populations, we often now have to clean our own water, which costs us millions of dollars. We also see that healthy ecosystems can help moderate weather extremes. A good example of this is a healthy forest. In a healthy forest, trees will help participate in the water cycle. Much of the water moves from the ground through the trees and evaporates from the trees into the atmosphere. When that water evaporates, it'll eventually condense and fall back as rain. If we cut down the trees and deforestation occurs, the plants will contribute less and less to the evaporation process. This means less water is going to the atmosphere and more water is running off to other ecosystems. This can create droughts in areas. These ecosystem services can be highly valuable on an economic level for humans. Some studies have attempted to put monetary value to the ecosystem services found around the globe. The world's ecosystems have been estimated to be worth more than $33 trillion per year. This table shows us the value of certain ecosystems. We can see that places like open ocean are highly valuable. These areas help with nutrient cycling and also provide us with products such as food. Estuaries are very important for nutrient cycling and other reasons. So are tropical forests, seagrass, and algae beds, and swamps. We see that some ecosystems are very low in value, such as desert, ice and rock, tundra, and urban areas. These areas provide little to no ecosystem services. The other type of value that biodiversity has is intrinsic value. This is the inherent value of biodiversity, independent of its value to humans. It's said that some things have value just unto themselves. We can appreciate that value. Many people think nature is beautiful. We love to go out and watch organisms, dolphins swimming in the rivers, or whales in the ocean. Some people like to go birding or watch the sunset over the trees. These types of value can't really be given a monetary value, and if we lose biodiversity, we will lose that value as well. Our next question is, where do we find the most biodiversity? We've talked about this to some extent already. Warm, wet ecosystems have very high levels of solar energy. These are the areas where we find the highest biodiversity. Generally, these areas are near the equator. In this graph, we see that there is a higher level of biodiversity near the equator, 0 degrees on the map, versus other places as we go further north and south. This goes for both terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems. The reason the equator has more biodiversity boils back down to solar energy availability, evolutionary history of an area, and rate of disturbances. Solar energy provides energy for photosynthesizers, our primary producers, to take energy and turn it into food. The more plants we see in an area, the more herbivores there can be, which means the more predators. So, if we have more sunlight, we have more diversity in general. Tropical areas also tend to have longer evolutionary histories. This means that there's more time passing without climatic events such as ice ages, which allows organisms to have longer periods to evolve and adapt. The tropics are usually warm no matter what's going on. Even when the rest of the earth gets very cold, we often see that the equator will stay unfrozen and fairly warm, at least compared to the rest of the world. Again, this provides more time for those organisms to evolve and adapt. There are also no major winter events during or in tropical areas. If you think about even here in North Carolina, during the winter, plants shut down and go dormant. They lose all their leaves, organisms hibernate or move out. We have a period of dormancy. The further you go towards the equator, the less time you have where things need to go dormant. Even as far south as Florida, we see that there is no cold winter and that organisms are active year-round. The last factor we are going to look at is the rate of disturbance. If a habitat has an intermediate amount of disturbance, it tends to have a greater number of species. This idea is called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. It has been studied in many areas, such as New Zealand. In this study, we see they are looking at number of taxa versus disturbance levels around streams. In streams where there is very little disturbance, we see that diversity is very low. There are not a whole lot of organisms. If disturbances are too high, so there are too many floods per year, we see that diversity is also low. Organisms have trouble recovering and surviving in those areas. If the disturbances are intermediate or in the middle, we see that the diversity goes up. This disturbance allows different types of organisms to be coming in and out constantly and keeps our communities healthy. If we look around the equator, we see different biodiversity hotspots. There are about 25 different hotspots around the world. These 25 areas cover less than 1% of the world's surface area, but have 20% or more of the world's species. Often when we look at conservation, we focus in on these biodiversity hotspots. We will talk about that more in one of the later lessons. In this lesson, we have looked at what is biodiversity, why biodiversity is important, and where we can find the most biodiversity. In the next lessons, we will look at the threats to biodiversity and conservation efforts to save biodiversity.